In a number of our previous videos, we've discussed some of the benefits of renewable energy technologies, and one of the things that we've referred to in particular is that they can be used to produce clean energy, or energy without any carbon dioxide being produced. Now, what we're going to look at in this video is a way of comparing two different renewable energy technologies in order to determine how much CO2 they actually produce. But this time, we're not just going to be looking at their operating life in isolation, we're also going to be looking at their pre-operating life and their post-operating life, or what we call their full life cycle. So we're going to look at two different things. We're going to look at something called an energy payback analysis, and we're going to look at something called a lifecycle analysis. So we're going to look at the considerations for both an energy payback analysis and a lifecycle analysis. We're also going to look at an example as to how this can be applied. Now finally, we're going to look at something called Lifecycle Assessment harmonization, and that's a way of collating lots of different sets of data in order to come up with more definitive conclusions. So the first thing that we need to consider is something called energy payback analysis. And the simplest way to think about energy payback is that when we manufacture a wind turbine or a solar panel, it uses a certain amount of energy. Energy is required to harness the raw materials as an example, and energy is required during the manufacturing processes. And we also require energy for getting the components to site and assembling those components. Now, when we conduct an energy payback analysis, what we're really looking at is how long it will take for that energy to be repaid. So how long will it take for the new energy generating capacity to produce enough electricity to cover the energy that is already used in manufacture? So energy payback is all about the energy used to produce the technology when compared to the amount of energy that's being produced. Separate to that, we have something called life cycle analysis. And life cycle analysis is more about the amount of carbon dioxide, or more about the contaminants that the process is producing. So once again, we consider from the start of the process to the end of the working life of the component, but what we consider is how much CO2 is being produced. Another name for life cycle analysis is cradle to grave analysis. And if we relate that to something like a wind farm, the cradle to grave time is the time from harnessing raw materials to the time of decommissioning, at the end of the life cycle of the wind turbine or the wind farm. So what we have here is a diagram that's useful to depict the life cycle of a wind turbine. So along the bottom we have a number of different stages. First of all, we have the harnessing of raw materials. That might be steel as an example for use in the tower of the wind turbine. Next we have the suppliers, and there'll be suppliers of raw material, but the important thing that this highlights is that those suppliers are also going to use energy, and those suppliers are also going to produce CO2. So this would also have to be considered in the life cycle assessment of our wind turbine. Now, the suppliers of the raw materials need to transport those to the manufacturers. So again, there's going to be energy costs and carbon dioxide produced as a result of that. Then we have manufacturing, which is the production of each of our wind turbine components. So once the components are manufactured, they need to be transported to site so that the components can be installed. Now, once all of that has taken place, we have our wind turbines in position and they can begin their operating life. During their operating life, they're going to produce energy to repay back the energy deficit caused during their manufacture. And as this is a clean energy source, they're going to produce very little CO2 once they're manufactured and once they're installed. But what we can see is that the likelihood is quite a lot of carbon dioxide or quite a lot of contaminants have been produced during the process. Now, after the wind turbine's operating life, something else we would need to consider is disposal of all of those materials. Some may well be recyclable, others are going to be placed in landfill as waste. So what this demonstrates is that there's a huge number of considerations if we want to conduct a full life cycle analysis of a given component or a given renewable energy technology. In addition, if we want to conduct an energy payback analysis, we do need to consider each of these steps in the sourcing and manufacturing process. So let's take a look at an example of an energy payback and life cycle analysis. Now, the example that we're looking at here is from a document called an environmentally friendly investment, and this document was produced by Vestas, which is a wind turbine manufacturer. Now this particular analysis relates to their VAT 2 megawatt onshore wind turbine. So what this diagram on the right hand side shows is that during the sourcing of materials and manufacturing of the wind turbines, we end up in a deficit in terms of energy. We know this is energy because our units here are megawatt hours. So we have a deficit of energy before the wind turbine starts its operating life cycle. Now when it starts its operating life cycle, eventually we're going to get back to the 0 point. So in effect, we're going to have produced enough energy to cover all of the energy used during manufacture. Now what this document indicates for this particular wind turbine is that this point occurs at roughly 7.7 months. So the turbine is operational for 7.7 months before it's then producing energy in excess of the energy used for its manufacture. Bearing in mind an onshore wind farm has a typical life cycle of 25 years, we've lost around 7 months worth of energy, paying back the energy used in its production. Now this break-even point would be different for different technologies, different sizes of wind turbines and so on. So it really is just to give you an indication of what this sort of information can tell us. So for a life cycle analysis, another thing we need to consider is CO2 emissions. Now when we do a life cycle analysis, what we're looking at is the amount of CO2 that's being produced throughout the life cycle. And what we see here is the amount of CO2 produced per kilowatt hour of electricity that's being produced. So this takes into consideration the CO2 emissions during manufacture, as well as the CO2 emissions during its operating life cycle. And we're comparing that with the amount of electrical energy that's actually being produced. Now once again, this is just an example, but what we see is that the onshore wind turbine's CO2 emissions are very, very low in comparison with both the gas-fired power station and the coal-fired power station. The other thing this shows is that gas produces much less CO2 than coal. Now one thing that's important to point out at this stage is that one of the objections people have to wind turbines or solar power as an example is that it isn't truly clean energy. People will make the observation that it isn't clean energy because of the CO2 that's produced during sourcing materials and manufacture and so on. And to a certain extent they have a valid point. But what we also need to remember is that building a gas-fired power station is going to produce CO2, and building a coal-fired power station is going to produce CO2. And let's say for argument's sake that the amount of CO2 produced to build a wind farm was exactly the same as the amount of CO2 produced to build a gas-fired power station. But what we need to consider in order for this to be a fair comparison is how much CO2 is produced throughout the life cycle. And that's exactly what we do in a life cycle assessment. So when we look at a chart similar to the one shown at the top here, we can see that the amount of CO2 produced by the wind farm over its life cycle is very small in comparison to the other two technologies. And that's something that's important to educate people about. What this document also highlights is that the vast majority of the CO2 produced when building a wind turbine is produced during extracting and processing of the materials. And that's what we would expect. Here it gives a breakdown of how much CO2 is produced during each of those phases, and we can see that the extraction and processing of the iron produces by far the most carbon dioxide. So taking all of these things into consideration, we can now consider the life cycle assessment data for different renewable energy technologies. Now the data that we're looking at here is called harmonized data. Now what that means is that a number of different studies or a number of different data sets have been collated. And this data has been prepared by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So we certainly have a reputable data source here. So what they've done is they've taken a number of different sets of data and they've combined that data. By harmonizing data, it means it takes averages, but it also disregards any data that may skew the evidence. So it's a case of sorting through the data, seeing what's credible, and then determining averages based on that information. Now this first chart here looks at a number of different energy technologies. And just to explain our axes, on the y-axis we have life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. And that's greenhouse gas emissions produced per kilowatt hour of electricity. So again, it's a comparison of how much carbon dioxide is produced when compared to the amount of electricity that's being produced over the lifetime. On these box plots, we have the median value in the centre, and then we have 75% and 25%, what we call percentiles. That means within the blue region, the middle 50% of the data sits in that region. And then we have the outlying data on the outsides. So I guess what we're really concerned with is the median value. And in terms of the spread of the data, we're concerned with the spread of the middle 15%. On our x-axis, on this diagram, we have a number of different technologies. So at the bottom here, we have photovoltaics, or our solar cells. And then we have our concentrated solar power, which is the thermal solar energy power plants. Note that these are both sitting very low in terms of the amount of CO2 produced. Next, we have our wind, onshore and offshore, and we have our nuclear. So it's clear to see here that all of these technologies produce relatively low levels of carbon dioxide throughout their life cycle. We see quite a significant jump up to the natural gases, or the combined cycle gas turbine plants, and then we see another significant jump up to our coal burning plants. So it certainly gives an indication as to which energy technologies are producing the most carbon dioxide. This diagram here looks at onshore and offshore wind, and what we can see from this diagram is that both produce roughly the same amount of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour of energy they're going to produce over their life cycle. Now what we can see from this diagram is that we're producing roughly 12 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilowatt hour of energy we're producing. So roughly 12 grams of carbon dioxide. This diagram looks at our different solar energy technologies. We have the crystalline silicon technology, which uses a silicon semiconductor, and we have another technology called thin film. But what we see here is the amount of carbon dioxide produced per kilowatt hour of electricity is around 55. Now recall that for wind it was roughly 12. So in actual fact, the amount of carbon dioxide produced by a solar power plant is roughly 4 to 5 times more than for a wind farm. But please don't forget, when we compare that to gas and coal, we're still looking at very, very low carbon dioxide emissions. This is purely just to give you another point of comparison or a means of comparing wind energy to solar energy. So in this video, we've considered something called Energy Payback Analysis, and we've also considered something called Lifecycle Analysis. We looked at the different considerations when carrying out an energy payback analysis and a life cycle analysis, and we also looked at a specific example of what this type of information can tell us. Finally, we looked at some credible life cycle assessment harmonised data from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory.